I'm Doug Dormer. This is the Abatement Information Masterclass, establishing the Criterion Standard for opioid settlement funding and avoiding the tobacco failure. This is Lesson 1, the $57 billion opportunity and risk. Why opioid abatement must not repeat the tobacco failure. So before we discuss the opioid settlement, we have to look back at an earlier settlement that is proving to be terribly important in terms of the approach taken with respect to the opioid settlement. That earlier settlement is the 1998 Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement, which caused the tobacco companies to contribute over $250 billion to a fund somewhat similar to the opioid settlement fund. We begin by asking, did that have the same purpose? To prevent or to treat or to sustain the avoidance, the refraining from tobacco use? We look at Recital 6 in that Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement, where it says the settling states and the participating manufacturers are committed to reducing youth smoking and promoting public health, and that the settling states should use the funds provided by the tobacco companies to reduce tobacco use and to fund smoking cessation and prevention programs. Let me say that again. Settling states should use the funds provided by the tobacco companies to reduce tobacco use and to fund smoking cessation and prevention programs. That language is very similar to the language in the Opioid Settlement Agreement that talks about prevention, treatment, and sustained recovery from addiction. So let's look at what we learned from the tobacco settlement failure and consider how it is shaping the opioid settlement agreement. First, we note that less than 3% of the $246 billion tobacco settlement actually went to smoking cessation or treatment. So to address that, in the opioid settlement agreements, there's a place called Section 6 that provides exactly what you're allowed to spend the money on and strongly communicates that you can't just replace existing expenditures, you actually have to bring something new to the community. Then there's an issue called the data vacuum. There was no mandatory national evidence lab or reporting or requirements in the tobacco settlement. Now we're seeing some standards and some requirements, and we'll talk about those in detail in a little bit. As a result, in the tobacco failure, they could not prove which programs worked, leading to decades of, as it's called, check passing without clinical accountability. There was also, if you will, an administrative blind spot. Municipalities lacked an audit-ready shield, so many jurisdictions had no forensic trail to prove the money wasn't simply absorbed into the bureaucratic overhead. In fact, there really wasn't a penalty, even if you did put it into roads or other valid causes, but it had nothing to do with the tobacco settlement. In the case of the opioid settlement, they said we have to do something to avoid that. There also wasn't a balance between direct expenditures for a purpose and administrative costs. In the case of the opioid settlement agreement, there's a clear cap on administrative and overhead burden. You can't spend more than 15% of the money you get on administration. The rest has to go to those core functions that are spelled out in Section 6. And finally, we learned that the tobacco settlement, which was all of that money in one lump distribution, resulted in short-term thinking. The opioid settlement agreement stipulates that disbursements occur over 15 to 18 years, where the express intent is not just to fund it and then it's done, but the express intent is really to contribute to the evidence-based knowledge in the expectation that we will move to sustainable improvements in evidence-based practice, solutions that will be funded by traditional payers once the settlement money has been spent. So, a few key observations about the opioid settlement. It is a multi-district litigation consolidation. It's not a class action. That means every party, every municipality, every state, every district has its own agreement with the state and with the national fund. So they are direct participants, not just recipients of a grant. The nature of that relationship then makes it a contractual release of claims, not a grant at all. That contractual release contains performance obligations that didn't exist in the tobacco settlement. Therefore, the money that is being distributed is subject to withholding for future years or even clawback for the present years. And as we said earlier, there are some guide rails. You can't supplant existing expenditures or programs, although some states really relax that. We'll talk perhaps about that later. And you must fall into specific uses of prevention, treatment, and sustained recovery. While some things are spelled out quite clearly, there is flexibility, there is room for creativity. At the conference that we talked about, we had one county come up to us and say, we're looking at daycare for young mothers who are in intensive outpatient recovery programs. And they said, do you think that would fit? How will we know? A wonderful question. It turns out that mothers who are in addiction programs, who have young children, without daycare, they don't attend, they're distracted, they have a lower success rate. If you provide daycare to give the mother the freedom to participate in the program, we think you have a higher success rate. I say we think because there isn't the sufficient evidence base to document that or prove that. Therefore, you can't get to sustainable payments from insurance companies for daycare in that case until you demonstrate as value and a consistent pattern over a large enough population. The 13,000 settlement participants included in direct and indirect, but not including abatement partners. Funding over 15 to 8 years, diminishing over time. And finally, it's worth noting that every state is different, particularly in the mix of state, county, and municipality distribution. We put together this to get around that idea we've been talking about. The gold line represents the settlement catalyst funding, the $57 billion. The brighter color on the left shows that in the earlier years, 2022, more money was spent. And all the way through 2026, this year with the addition of the first tranche of the Purdue-Sackler Pharmaceutical Company's money, the $7 billion that has been recently added, we're seeing a fair amount of money early that diminishes, not quite to nothing, but it does diminish over the 20 years. Which is why, as we interpret the requirements and the agreements, there's an expectation that we will use the settlement funding to collect sufficient evidence about successful interventions that then will transition to sustainable funding, whether it's Medicaid or health insurance of whatever plan, or the VA or tribal health care, that will then pick up and replace the Sackler funding, making this a sustainable, ongoing intervention for the benefit of society. So we break this into 3 phases. Phase 1, which we are nearing the end of now, is kind of a let's get this off the ground. It's the catalyst in compliance, focusing primarily on financial related things. You can see the details here. Then we see a second phase with proven efficacy. That's the phase we're entering, and that's the exciting moment that we are in right now. How do you evaluate the interventions in the programs? How do you add creative opportunities and evaluate them, which leads to a sustainable evaluation, an ongoing learning health system, and funding that carry us far beyond this initial funding of the settlement agreement. Which leaves us with the key takeaway. Really, it's a restatement of the takeaway from the introduction. What are you learning from all that money? And how will it affect prevention, treatment, and sustained recovery over the long term? Now, we mentioned that we have a survey we'd like you to participate in. This isn't a quiz, but it will be immensely valuable, and we'd love to have you participate with us. You can take this survey at any time. I'd kind of like to see you get through the lessons first, but since it's not, one is not dependent on the other, take the survey when you want. So here's the QR code. and the link to that survey. So thanks for watching this video. Please return for Masterclass 2, the flight deck versus the paper map, modernizing municipal data governance to prove value and reduce risk.